everyone, I'm Sarah of Rich Textures Crochet and welcome. Today we're going to learn how to crochet the Brier Island Triangle Shawl. This is a crochet shawl that I designed while visiting the island this past summer. It's one of my absolute favorite places to visit, and so we're going to work this pattern today. Now this crochet shawl, as I mentioned, is a triangular design. You're going to work I guess kind of across the back and down toward this center point, and that for the pattern. It is worked in a sport weight yarn. I'm working with the Panda yarns, 100% cotton. It's a 5-ply sport weight. Each cake has 1600 yards in it, and you're going to use almost the entire cake to work this crochet shawl. You're also going to need a 4mm or a G crochet hook, and then of course some scissors and a yarn needle for finishing it off. The free written instructions can be found on my website at richtexturescrochet.com, and there is a direct link for you in the description of this video, as well as some other photos there as well. So thank you so much for joining me. While you're here, I invite you to take a look around. Don't forget to subscribe. This channel is updated every single week with free crochet patterns and stitch tutorials, and you'll find other crochet shawls under the Crochet Shawl playlist. Now, I neglected to mention the dimensions of the shawl earlier in the video. Your finished shawl today is going to measure 70 inches across the back, the straight edge, down to a depth of about 41 inches, so that goes down to your bottom point. Also, a couple things about working with the Panda yarn. As you'll see here, it is comprised of 5 loose strands of thread. You're going to hold all these strands together as you are working. When I'm working with this yarn, I do prefer to pull from the center of the yarn cake. You're going to start by making your slip knot and chaining 2. Or, alternatively, you may begin by making a magic ring. It's up to you. If you're working with a magic ring, you will work the first row into the center of your magic ring. If you are working with a chain 2, you will work row 1 into the second chain from your hook. To begin row 1, you're going to chain 3, which counts as a double crochet stitch. Next, work 1 more double crochet into your ring. Chain 2 and work 2 more double crochet stitches into the center of your ring. Chain 2 and 2 more double crochets into the center of your ring. Chain 2, and finally 2 more double crochet stitches into the center ring. Your chain 3 at the start does count as a double crochet stitch, so at the end of this row you have a total of 8 double crochet stitches. You're then going to chain 2 and turn your work. Now for row 2, we're going to work a beginning cluster V-stitch into the first stitch. To work the beginning cluster V-stitch, you'll have started with your chain 2. You're then going to double crochet back into the same stitch. Chain 1 and work a cluster stitch into the same stitch. To work your cluster stitch, you're going to yarn over, insert your hook into that same stitch, yarn over, draw up a loop, yarn over and pull through 2 loops. Repeat that, yarn over, insert your hook into the same stitch, yarn over, draw up a loop. Yarn over and pull through 2 loops. You'll have 3 loops on your hook. Yarn over and pull through all 3 loops. That is your beginning cluster V-stitch. Now you're going to move to the chain 2 space, and into the chain 2 space you're going to work a cluster V-stitch. To work the cluster V-stitch, you're going to work a cluster stitch, chain 1 and cluster stitch back into the same chain 2 space. Next, into the next chain 2 space, you're going to work a cluster shell stitch. To work your cluster shell stitch, you're going to work a cluster V-stitch. So cluster stitch, chain 1 and cluster stitch. Then chain 2 and work another cluster V-stitch into that same space. This is going to form the bottom point of your triangle shawl. You're now working up the opposite side. Into your next chain 2 space, you're going to work a cluster V-stitch, and into your final cluster stitch, into your final stitch, work one final cluster V-stitch. And this is just into that final cluster. That brings you to the end of your row 2, and you should start to see that triangle shape coming through. You're going to chain 2 and turn your work. The chain 2 starts as your beginning cluster, so for row 3, we're just going to finish that beginning cluster into the first stitch. So just double crochet back into the first stitch. Next, into the next chain 1 space, you're going to work a cluster V-stitch. You're going to work cluster V-stitches into each chain 1 space all the way across to this chain 2 point. So cluster V-stitch into your next chain 1 space, cluster V-stitch into the next chain 1 space, until you come to that chain 2 space. When you come to the chain 2 space, you're going to work your cluster shell. So cluster V-stitch, then chain 2 and work a cluster V-stitch back into that same space. Next, cluster V-stitch in each chain 1 space all the way back to your first stitch. I have one more chain 1 space here. Cluster V-stitch into that final chain 1 space, and then you're simply going to end with a cluster stitch into the top of your final stitch. And that brings you to the end of row 3. You can chain 2 and turn your work. For row 4, we're going to work a beginning cluster V-stitch into this first stitch, into the top of our first cluster stitch. Next, into the next chain 1 space, and into each chain 1 space across to our chain 2 space, you're going to work a cluster V-stitch. So cluster V-stitch into each chain 1 space all the way across to your chain 2. So there's 1, 2, 3, and then I have 1 more. When you come to that chain 2 space, into the chain 2 space, you're going to work a cluster shell. So cluster V-stitch, chain 2, and cluster V-stitch back into the same chain 2 space. Just as you did before, you're going to work 1 cluster V-stitch in each chain 1 space all the way across. When you come to the end of this row, you're going to work 1 cluster V-stitch into the top of your final cluster stitch. That brings you to the end of row 4. Now for the pattern for rows 5 through to row 40, you're going to repeat your rows 3 and 4 17 more times. So your row 3 began with that simple beginning cluster in the first stitch, followed by your cluster V stitches in each chain 1 space, and then the row 4, which we just worked. You want to repeat your rows 3 and 4 for a total of 17 times. You're then going to repeat row 3 once more. If you would like, head over to richtexturescrochet.com. The direct link is in the description of this video, and these repeats are repeated in the instructions there. So you're going to go ahead, repeat through to the end of row 40, and then meet me back here. Now for your shawl, you'll have worked through to the end of row 41. For the purposes of this video, I'm just going to work this small swatch and then move on to beginning at row 42. Now this does bring up a good point. If you would like to adjust the size of your shawl, you can simply work as many repeats of your row 3 and 4 as you would like. You'll just want to make sure that you end off on that repeat of row 3. So at the end of row 41, you're going to finish off by chaining 1 and turning your work. Now for row 42, you're going to work 2 single crochet stitches into your first stitch. So just into the top of that starting cluster stitch. You're then going to work 1 single crochet stitch into the top of each cluster stitch and into each chain 1 space all the way across to that chain 2 space. So single crochet into each stitch and each chain 1 space all the way across to the chain 2. Again, yours will be much larger. I've only worked 1 more repeat of my rows just to give you an idea of how far that got me. But you'll have worked a total of 41 rows. So then in row 42, when you come to that chain 2 space, into the chain 2 space, you're going to work 3 single crochet stitches, all into the same chain 2 space. You're then going to continue working single crochet stitches into each stitch and each chain 1 space all the way across until you come to your final stitch. When you come all the way across to your final stitch, which is your cluster stitch in row 42, you're going to finish off by working 2 single crochet stitches into that same stitch. Chain 1 and turn your work. Now for row 43, you're going to work 2 single crochet stitches into that first stitch, and then single crochet into each stitch all the way across until you come to that second single crochet stitch in the set of 3 that you worked into that chain 2 space. So single crochet all the way across until you come to that second stitch in the set of 3 that you worked into that chain 2 space. When you come across to that second stitch in that set of 3, so we're here at our point, again, you're going to work 3 single crochet stitches into that second stitch. There's 1, 2, and 3. That will give you your nice sharp point at the bottom of your shawl. You're going to then turn and work up the other side of your shawl, working 1 single crochet into each stitch all the way across until you come to that final stitch. At the end of row 43, work 2 single crochet stitches into that final single crochet stitch. You're then going to chain 3, and this counts as a double crochet stitch, and turn your work. Now for row 44, we're going to double crochet into the first stitch. So including your chain 3, you have 2 double crochet stitches worked into this first stitch. You're then going to chain 1, skip the next stitch, and double crochet into your next stitch. we're going to repeat this all the way across to our point, which is going to be a total of 93 times. So chain 1, skip the next stitch, double crochet into your next stitch. Repeat that 93 times, and that should bring you down to the center point in your shawl. When you come all the way down to that center point into the next stitch, you're going to work 3 double crochet stitches, all into the same stitch. You're then going to double crochet into your next stitch, and then chain 1, skip the next stitch, double crochet into the next stitch, and you're going to again repeat that a total of 93 times all the way up to your final stitch. When you come all the way across at the end of row 44 to your final stitch, you're going to finish off this row by simply working a double crochet into the final stitch. So you'll have 2 double crochet stitches worked into the final stitch. You're then going to chain 3, which counts as a double crochet stitch, and turn your work. Now for row 45, we're going to double crochet into the first stitch. Chain 1, and then double crochet into the next stitch. Chain 1, skip the next chain 1 space, and double crochet into your next stitch. You're going to repeat this for a total of 94 times. Chain 1, skip the next chain 1 space, double crochet into your next stitch. This is going to bring you all the way across to the bottom point of your shawl. When you come all the way across to the point in your shawl, you're going to skip that next stitch, double crochet into the center stitch. You're then going to work 2 more double crochet stitches into the point of your shawl. Chain 1, skip the next stitch, double crochet into your next stitch. Chain 1, skip the next chain 1 space, double crochet into your next stitch. You're going to repeat that for a total of 94 times all the way across to the end of the row. When you come all the way across, you're going to chain 1, and you have 1 stitch remaining, chain 1, and you're going to finish off the row by working 2 double crochet stitches into the final stitch. Chain 3 and turn your work. Now for row 46, we're going to work a double crochet into the first stitch, then chain 1 and double crochet into the next stitch. Chain 1, skip the next chain 1 space and double crochet into your next stitch, And you're going to repeat that for a total of 95 times all the way across to the center point. Chain 1, skip the next chain 1 space, and double crochet into your next stitch all the way across. When you come across to your center point, you're going to work 3 double crochet stitches into that next stitch. Then double crochet into your next stitch. Chain 1, skip the next chain 1 space, double crochet into your next stitch. Repeat that all the way across. Chain 1, skip the space, double crochet in the next stitch. Repeat that 95 times, and that will bring you to your final stitch. When you come all the way across, you're going to finish off with a chain 1 and then work 2 double crochet stitches into your final stitch. That brings you to the end of row 46. Chain 1 and turn your work. Now for row 47, we're going to work another row of single crochet stitches. Work 2 single crochets into your first stitch, and then work 1 single crochet into each stitch and each chain 1 stitch all the way across to the second double crochet in that set of 3 double crochet stitches that form the bottom point of your shawl. When you come to that second double crochet into that set of 3 at your point, you're going to work 3 single crochet stitches all into that same stitch, and then continue to single crochet up the other side all the way until you come to your final stitch, working 1 single crochet in each stitch and 1 single crochet into each chain 1 space, all the way till you come to your final stitch. Into that final stitch, work 2 single crochet stitches. When you come all the way across to your final stitch, which is the turning chain 3, you're going to work 2 single crochets into that turning chain 3, chain 1, and turn your work. We're going to work 1 more row of single crochet stitches. For row 48, work 2 single crochets into that first stitch, and then single crochet in each stitch all the way across to that bottom point. And then you know what to do. Work 3 single crochet stitches into that bottom point, continue up the side, and work 2 single crochets into your final stitch. That will bring you to the end of your row 48. For row 49, we're going to begin working some of our cluster stitch rows once again. So what we're going to do is we're going to chain 2 and turn our work. You're then going to work a beginning cluster into the first stitch. Next, work a cluster V-stitch into the next stitch. Skip the next 2 stitches and work a cluster V-stitch into the next stitch. You're then going to repeat that all the way across to your center point, so 65 times. Skip the next 2 stitches, work a cluster V-stitch into the next stitch, skip the next 2 stitches, cluster V-stitch into your next stitch, all the way down until you come to that center point. Once you come all the way across to your center stitch, you're going to skip the next 2 stitches, and into that center stitch you're going to work your cluster shell stitch. So your cluster V-stitch, then chain 2 and cluster V-stitch back into the same stitch. Then skip the next 2 stitches and work your cluster V-stitch in the next stitch, and repeat that all the way across to your final stitch. When you come all the way across at the end of row 49, you're going to finish off with a cluster stitch into the final stitch. Chain 2 and turn your work. Now for row 50, we're going to work a beginning cluster V-stitch into the first stitch. Then into the next, chain 1 space, work a cluster V-stitch. You are going to work 1 cluster V-stitch in each chain 1 space all the way across down to the chain 2 point. When you come across to your chain 2 point, you're going to work a cluster shell into that chain 2 space. So cluster V-stitch, chain 2, and cluster V-stitch back into the same space. You're then going to continue working cluster V-stitches, 1 in each chain 1 space all the way across, and you're going to finish off this row with a cluster stitch into the top of your final stitch. When you come all the way across at the end of row 50, you're finishing off with the cluster V-stitch into your final stitch. You're going to chain 2 and turn your work. For row 51, work a beginning cluster into the first stitch, so just double crochet back into that first stitch, and then work a cluster V-stitch into your chain 1 space. You're going to work your cluster V-stitches just as you did all the way down to your chain 2 space. In that chain 2 space, work your cluster shell stitch, and then continue working cluster V stitches in each chain 1 space all the way across. When you come to your final stitch, you're going to work your cluster stitch into the final stitch, and you're then going to repeat these last 2 rows, rows 50 and 51, twice more. You're going to finish off on a repeat of row 51, and then meet me back here. That will bring you to the end of row 55. Again, the free written instructions are on richtexturescrochet.com or linked directly in the description of this video if you'd like to follow along. So work to the end of row 55 and meet me back here, and we will finish off our shawl. Okay, so now you will have worked actually 4 extra rows, 4 more rows than I have in my shawl. You'll be at the end of row 55, which is an ending on a repeat of row 51. So this is my final 51 row that I just worked. Once you've worked row 55, you're going to chain 1 and turn your work. Then for row 56, you're going to work, and row 57, you're going to work a couple more rows of single crochet stitches. So for rows 56 and 57, you're going to work 2 single crochet stitches into that first stitch, then single crochet in each stitch, or in this case each stitch and each chain 1 space, all the way across to that center point. In the center point, work 3 single crochet stitches, then continue up your side and finish off with 2 single crochet stitches in your final stitch, just as you did before when you were working before the open stitch work. So work 2 rows of single crochet stitches, and then meet me back here at the end of row 57. At the end of row 57, you have 1 more row to work. For row 58, chain 1 and turn your work. Now for row 58, you're going to single crochet into the first stitch. You're then going to work a picot stitch. To work your picot, you're going to chain 3 and then slip stitch back into the 3rd chain from your hook. That is how you work your picot. You're then going to single crochet back into the same stitch. Next, work a single crochet in each of the next 3 stitches. Followed by a picot, chain 3 and slip stitch back into the 3rd chain from your hook. Next, work a single crochet into each of the next 4 stitches. Followed by a picot stitch. You're going to repeat this all the way across to your center point. Single crochet into each of the next 4 stitches and work 1 picot. Repeat that all the way across to your center point. When you come across to the point, you're going to single crochet into each of the next 3 stitches And then that will bring you to your center point. You can work a picot in the top of that stitch. Working along the other side, single crochet into each of the next 3 stitches and work a picot. Then single crochet into each of the next 4 stitches and picot. You're going to repeat that all the way across. Single crochet into each of your next 4 stitches and work 1 picot. Repeat that all the way across. When you come all the way across, you're going to finish off the row by working a single crochet in each of the next 2 stitches and then 2 single crochet stitches into that final stitch, followed by a picot. You're then going to fasten off, weave in your ends, and that is all there is to working your beautiful Brier Island shawl. Again, yours is going to be much larger than this one, and you will have only a small amount of your cake worked or left after working the full shawl, and that's all there is. So thank you so much for joining me. While you're here, once again, I invite you to subscribe, take a look around. If you happen to make the Brier Island shawl and share it on social media, do be sure to tag Rich Textures Crochet. I always love to come by and admire your work. So until next time, happy crocheting. Bye.